In this session, we're going to be talking about the court system and the role of judges in that system. We're going to be asking questions like, which law shall I apply to this case? And which court will hear my case? When we talk about jurisdiction, we talk about the power of the court to hear a case. For example, let's say two died in the ocean. Which court would you go to? How about if there was a death in your family? Your aunt dies, and you're the executor of the will. Which court would you go to? Let's say you're broke. You need to file for bankruptcy. Which court should you enter? We talk about original jurisdiction. We talk about the authority of the court to hear a case when it starts. Every court has a certain designated jurisdiction. The state court system is comprised of the state Supreme Court, the appellate level courts, which are the middle courts, and the lower courts. Normally, when you start a case in state court, you enter in the lower level trial courts. The federal court system is comprised of the U.S. Supreme Court at the top, the U.S. Court of Appeals in the middle, and the district court, which is like a state trial court. Here you can see a map of the U.S. courts with their geographic boundaries. A question of fact would be who, what, where, when, and how. You're talking about the elements of the case. Distinguish that from a question of law. Question of law is how a judge interprets and applies the law. As you know from reading the case book, appellate courts only deal with questions of law. Must the Supreme Court hear every case that's presented for appeal? What do you think? No, they don't. The Supreme Court hears only 200 of the 4,000 cases that it receives every year. Think for a minute, what kinds of criteria should the court use when it decides which 200 of the 4,000 cases it's going to hear? A little bit of Supreme Court trivia, because I know that you've carefully read the chapter. How many judges sit on the Supreme Court? I'm going to pause for just 2 seconds while you tell me how many judges are in the Supreme Court. That's right, there's 9 judges. And how many of those Supreme Court justices are women? 3, you're right. And of those 3 women, which ones were appointed by President Obama? You're right again. Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. More trivia. How many African Americans are Supreme Court justices? Just one, and his name is Clarence Thomas. Federal judges have lifetime tenure. That means that they cannot be removed for the decisions they make. Do you think that's a good idea? Another question, just to think about, do you think judges should be elected or appointed? What would the difference be? Would they judge any differently if they were elected as opposed to appointed? And the final question I'm going to ask you is what criteria should be used to select a Supreme Court judge? There's an interactive exercise in this modular that helps you decide which criteria you think should be used to select a Supreme Court judge.